Scott Delgatti came along to my school in grade 8, and I didn't know him before, and as far as I can remember, nobody else knew who Scott Delgatti was. He just drifted into our school, a new student, and very quickly, my circle of friends fell in love with Scott. Scott loved school. He didn't love doing school. He loved being at school. He loved the fun of school. Scott was unusually tall. He was about 6'2" in grade 8. And he would come into school in the morning with his blue and red Adidas bag, those old Adidas bags with the big loop handles that we had in the 80s. And he would carry that over his shoulder into school every morning. And he would show up, his hair all over the place. And I know for a fact that he had just gotten out of bed, put on his blue corduroy jacket and his flannel shirt and his faded blue jeans and some shoes and grabbed that Adidas bag. And whatever was in it is what he brought to school. And usually what was inside that precious Adidas bag was a few miscellaneous textbooks, maybe some paper, maybe some food. You never knew what Scott was going to pull out of the bag. But Scott was a sprawler. And he was a sprawler because whenever we went into a classroom, he would pick the row of desks that was beside the wall so that he could wiggle into those old desks and he could just sprawl. And he would drop that Adidas bag beside him, and this was his ready position to learn. And usually, he wasn't looking forward. Usually, he was looking sideways at the entire class of students, because that's what intrigued him about school. It wasn't what the teacher had to say. It was what was going to unfold with him and the other students. Scott Delgatti had a great sense of humor, and he inspired us to have fun. He inspired us to laugh. We never knew what he was going to pull out of that Adidas bag or what he was going to say. And I remember frequently he would pull out an old dictionary or a textbook or maybe even a library book, and he would show us an animated movie that he had drawn on the corner of the pages of that book. Now, if you've ever seen this or done this, what you do is you start with the first page and you draw a simple animated drawing. And then you turn to the second page in the exact same position. You draw the drawing over again, but it's in a slightly different position. And he would take hours at home and during class to draw 10, 20, 40, 100 pages. And then he would take his thumb and carefully flicker through the pages, and you would see this still life animation. It was like the old cartoons. The only problem is he did this on his textbooks, library books, and it often got him into a lot of trouble. And so after he had shown us the little movie, we'd say, "Scott, close the book." "Scott, that's your math book. Or that's a library book. What are you going to do?" "I don't know, but isn't it a great movie?" And he would be so excited, and we would be excited, and we loved Scott for the crazy little things that he brought into our classroom. Mr. Dickinson was our grade 8 shop teacher. And Mr. Dickinson, like Scott, just drifted into our school in grade 8. We didn't know him before. He was only there for 1 year, filling in a position for a teacher who got sick. And if Scott was all about fun, Mr. Dickinson was all about business. When you came into his class, he was about 6'4", about 230. He was getting close to retirement, but he was a big, strong, imposing man of a teacher. And he created a presence. And you knew right off that when you walked in, it wasn't about having fun and doing what you wanted. It was about doing what he had planned. And when Scott entered his shop, two worlds collided. And Scott had a hard time in Mr. Dickinson's woodworking class because they just came at education from two very different directions. And it all came crashing down in the late spring of grade 8 when Darren DeCicco, this little Italian kid, about this tall, and Darren, he was like a pit bull. He'd weasel into your life or into something and he wouldn't let go, and he would just keep nattering at you or bugging you or saying something or taking something. And he was just kind of had that personality. And him and Scott Delgatti somehow got tangled up in Mr. Dickinson's woodworking class. And I don't know what happened during the class. All I remember is that as the bell went, I saw Darren DeChico go running out of the shop and Scott Delgatti chasing him, and his hands were like this as he was running. And I quickly saw a trail of sawdust behind him as he ran out of the class. And halfway down the hall, Scott Delgatti caught up with the little Darren DeChico, and he just filled his hair, his curly Italian hair, filled it with sawdust and just rubbed it in. Well, Mr. Dickinson followed the trail, found Scott, found Darren. I went off to class. I don't know what was said, what was done. But again, there was a buzz. There was something going on, and we were excited in grade 8 because Scott had stirred something up again. My shop class, where Mr. Dickinson taught, was mostly below ground. And all that we had for natural light was a row of windows across one side of the shop class that were about this deep. And so if you stood at the right angle, you could see up and you could see out. And what you saw was where people walked into the main entrance of the school. So depending on the time of day, there'd just be legs and feet and bags walking across the window. That's all you could see. Well, the same was true when you were outside looking in. You couldn't see much looking down into the shop, but if you stood at the right angle, you could see most of it. You could see people working. That afternoon, by chance, I was walking out of the school, and something caught my eye through those shop windows. And I stopped and looked, and there was Scott Delgatti with Mr. Dickinson, with the school principal. And I was like, what's going on? Something's going to happen here. And I remember, as clear as you sitting here right now, Scott Delgatti bending down and touching his toes, right like this. Now, this is 1981. And I remember Mr. Dickinson, with that big, strong forearm, picking up something off of one of the tables. And he walked up behind Scott, principal's there, and he hit the rear end of Scott with something so hard that it lifted Scott off of the ground. And I remember being delighted and laughing and going and telling my friends what I had just seen. The next day I came into class and I walked by Mr. Dickinson's desk, and I saw something hanging on the wall that I'd never seen before. It was a piece of 3/4 inch oak, about this wide by about this long with a big handle. It looked like a giant cutting board. And it had a little cord, and it was hung on a nail, and written on one side it said the Board of Education. I went, he got hit by the Board of Education. And before Mr. Dickinson came in, I turned it over, and on the other side was a Bible verse. I think it's from Philippians, I need thee every hour. Well, I laughed. I thought, just the irony of the whole situation, how this whole thing pulled together, and it was entertaining. And Scott faded out of grade 8. I never saw him in grade 9 again. And one of my memories of grade 8 was Scott Delgatti and what happened that day and how I interacted with him. Now, I'm going to come back to Scott in a minute, but let's come to where we are in the Sermon on the Mount. We're at Matthew 7:22, and this is really a really pivotal verse in the Sermon on the Mount, I think, because it's now taking us from Jesus giving and us listening, and now we're being challenged to do. And what's going to come after this verse is his challenge to bear fruit, his challenge to build a strong foundation on what is right, the idea to act, to go forward. Don't just keep it in your head, but move it down into your heart. Now, I'm a teacher, and I need you to work with me today. We're going to have a conversation. I need you to share with me. I'm going to ask you to do a few things. And the first thing I want to know is I would love to hear from a few people what you've heard, what you remember from Pastor Jim in the weeks leading up to this, from the Sermon on the Mount. Anybody at all? Just kind of gently raise your hand so I don't have 5 people talking all at once. What do you remember? What's a highlight from the Sermon on the Mount leading up to today? Yes?
I liked what Pastor Jim
Okay, thank you. Yes? Okay, good. What else? The Sermon on the Mount is loaded. What else do you remember? I'm really good at waiting. Anyone else?
Please, people, please. It's a whole year.
Yes. Okay. Good, the Beatitudes. Yes, sir.
Spectology and psychology. Meaning the speck in your eye, removing the plank that's in my eye.
Okay.
Or vice versa.
Good, thank you. Yes, please. Okay. All right, thank you. Yes, go ahead. Okay. Very good. Now we're going. Now we're flowing. Yes, sir, Frank.
Love your enemies.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
With the pearls before swine with witnessing, you kind of got to pick your battles. You don't just open up with both barrels at once because it could be very inappropriate.
Okay. Good. Good. Yes.
Set your heart on those things that are above where your heart is, so your treasure will be.
All right. Good. Good. Anybody else? The floodgates have opened. Matthew 7:12. So in everything, do unto others what you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. Notice the comma. So in everything, comma. Not so in everything. That beginning of that verse starts out with a command. So in everything. If we are followers of Jesus, we have an obligation here. This is a command. This isn't an option. This isn't a transition. Well, maybe. So in everything. And it raises some really interesting questions. First one for me is Scott Delgatti. Scott Delgatti wasn't my friend. I thought he was my friend, but looking back, he wasn't a friend. Because the way that I treated him, the way that he entered my life and I entered his life was really very shallow. My interest in him was simply, can he be entertaining and make me laugh? Beyond that, Scott drifted out of my memories, out of my school, and I have no idea where he is. And when I was in grade 9, it really didn't enter my mind, where is Scott this year? It also raises another question about what it means to be a Canadian in Canadian culture. We love our privacy. We love to be individuals. How many of you this morning have an iPhone in your possession? Take that out for me. If you have one right now with you, an iPhone, just hold it up. There's one. Oh, there's more than one. There's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, there's probably 15 or 20, and maybe some of us don't have it here. Apple has done a marvelous job in our society with the iPhone, the iPod, this idea, iTunes, about creating a device that is for me. It's got my movies, my information, my text, my pictures. We have been trained, we have been convinced, we've been sold that we are just individuals. And I think the people of this church realize that there's more to life than just the individual. I see that this morning. All the people I've met already, Frank and Ken and Patrick and Corby. I've probably forgotten others already, but you understand community. You get it here at Home Church. The other thing that tells me we're individuals is this device right here. This is probably one of my favorite electronic devices in the world. Anybody know what this is? Because some of you have it. Not a pager. Not. It is a receiver. It sends a signal. It opens something at my house. My garage door. You know that I can drive out of my house in the morning, go do my business, come back 2 hours later, drive in, and never have to talk to anybody? It's amazing. I don't have to wave to a neighbor. I don't have to have a conversation. I can jump in, put my seatbelt on, turn on the radio, back out, drive away, and I don't have to talk to anybody. We love to be private individuals. And that gets in the way of this command. The other thing that this provokes is technology, how we use it. There's a phrase that I heard a couple of months ago that I can't get out of my mind, and it's so true, and it just haunts me. We expect more from our technology than we do from each other. We expect more from our technology than we do from each other. That is very, very true in many cases, whether it's television, media, garage door openers, phones. We are always looking for what technology can deliver to improve our lives than what the other person can do when they enter our life or when we enter their life. I remember sitting at a parent-teacher conference. Parent came in, sat right there and faced me, and it was a mom. This was about 3 years ago. And we were in the middle of a great conversation about her son. And suddenly her phone went off. Yeah, we've all been there. And I just kind of paused in the conversation and waited for her to turn it off. She didn't. She answered it. We've all done that. We've probably made the same mistake. We've been on both sides of this. And so I thought it must be an important conversation. House is burning down. One of the kids has cut their hand off in a meat grinder. Who knows? Something serious. And so I thought I'll just wait till she's done. Well, she got into this conversation about, I think, pizza dinner or babysitting or something. It was fairly trivial. And I thought I'll just wait it out. She's almost done. She stood up and started walking around. And after about 3 minutes, she came and sat down again. And I thought, you know what? I'll give you some space. I can understand. And I just kind of sat there and waited for her to explain and apologize. And she just looked at me and waited for me to carry on as if nothing had happened. And I sat there and I thought, what just happened? That this phone, this device, this great technology that we can use in so many wonderful ways, interrupted a great conversation where she was opening the door of her family's life a little bit, and I was opening the door of her son's education a little bit, and we were kind of walking back and forth across that threshold and just engaging one another. It gets in the way of this command. So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. I want to find out a little bit about where you're at this morning. So I have something I call fist to five that I do with my students all the time. And I'm going to get you to help me with this morning. You're going to be as honest as you dare. You're going to vote fist. I would never, ever do that. You're insane for suggesting such a thing. To absolutely. That makes perfect sense to me. Or you're somewhere in the middle. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to be at this end, or somewhere in between? So you can be as honest as you dare here. Here's my first statement. Completely disagree, that's crazy, to completely agree. On the way to church on a Sunday morning, if I drove somebody who was clearly broken down on the side of the road, their hood was up, or they were standing looking at the engine like it was going to magically fix itself, I would stop and inquire if I could help. Fist, honestly, I wouldn't do that. 5, I've done it, I'll do it again, it makes perfect sense, or something in between. Be as honest as you dare. 1, 2, 3, 4, just stick up. Okay, good. I see a wide spectrum. That's good. Thank you for being honest. Here's my second statement. I'm in the checkout line, and the cashier isn't making eye contact. Clearly, they are upset about something. I would initiate a conversation about how their day is going. Fist, I could never do that. 5, that would be very easy for me. I've done it before, or anything in between. Good. All right. The next question. On a bus, public transit, or the SkyTrain perhaps if you're going into Vancouver, I would get on that public transit and I would sit beside someone, even if there were empty seats that I could sit in and have a whole row or bench to myself. I would sit beside them so perhaps I could engage them in a conversation. There's no way I could do that. Absolutely, I could do that. All right. Good, thank you. And 2 more here. They're getting a little tougher. My neighbor lost his job, and while he is looking for a new job and having trouble paying his bills, I would consider paying his mortgage. There's no way I could ever consider that. Yeah, I think I could do that. Okay, thank you. And the last one. I prefer to talk to people I don't know digitally, chatting, email, Facebook, Snapchat, you name it, rather than face-to-face. So I would rather talk to someone that I want to get to know, but I haven't met them before. I'd rather initiate that conversation with a new person digitally rather than face-to-face. So, absolutely, I need the face-to-face. All right. Thank you very much for being honest. That brings us to a tension that I want to talk about today, and that's the tension between hospitality and hostility. And each of those little scenarios that I gave you, you had to wrestle with that tension. Hostility, this might be difficult, it might be a stranger, it might be someone who doesn't like me or I don't like them for whatever reason, to hospitality where I'm willing to engage them. And I want to read to you from an author, Henry Nouwen, about this tension. At first, the word hospitality might evoke an image of soft, sweet kindness. Tea parties, bland conversations, and a general atmosphere of coziness. Probably this has its good reason, since in our culture, the concept of hospitality has lost much of its power and is often used in circles where we are more prone to expect a watered-down conversation than something authentic and open. But still, if there is any concept worth restoring in our culture, it's this concept of hospitality. It is one of the richest biblical terms that can deepen and broaden our insight in our relationships with one another. Old and New Testament stories not only show how serious our obligation is to welcome a stranger into our lives, but they also tell us that guests are often carrying precious gifts with them and are eager to give them to us. When Abraham received 3 strangers at Mamre and offered them water, bread, and a fine tender calf, they revealed themselves to him as the Lord, announcing that Sarah would have a child. When the widow at Zarephath offered food and shelter to Elijah, he revealed himself as a man of God, offering her an abundance of oil and meal, raising her son from the dead. When the 2 travelers to Emmaus invited the stranger who had joined them on the road to stay with them for the night, he made himself known in the breaking of the bread as their Lord, Jesus. When hostility is converted into hospitality, then fearful strangers can become guests, revealing to their host the promise they carry with them. Then, in fact, the distinction between host and guest proves to be really nothing important, and it evaporates in a newfound friendship. Thus, biblical stories help us to realize not just that hospitality is an important virtue, but even more that in the context of hospitality, the guest and the host can reveal their most precious gifts and bring new life to each other. Let's talk about those words for a minute. Hospitality and hostility both come from a Latin word, hospice, or hospita. And we get our words like hospital, hospice, host, hotel. They all come from those root words. And there's another variation of hospice, which is hostis, which we get the word hostility from. But the two words are closely related. And there's a really fascinating interplay because the word hospice means both the guest and the host. Like in English where we have the word loan. You can give a loan or you can take a loan. It's a two-way. You can be on either end of that action. And hospice indicates that same thing. And then you have the word hostis, this idea of the stranger, that which you don't know, that which is maybe uncomfortable or foreign to you. And there's that same interplay. The words interplay with one another. And when it comes to hospitality and hostility, there's that interplay. We can be on either side. We can be the person who's asking for help at the side of the road and hoping that someone stops. Or we can be the person who drives along and has the opportunity to stop. And so there's this tension. And I think that's what we have to figure out and overcome with this command. So in everything. Now, some of you, when you held up your vote, you clearly said, I can't do that. You held up the fist. And I'm with you on some of those. I cannot imagine being able to engage a stranger for whatever reason in some of those situations. But I think when we are commanded to do this, that is at the core, that is at the heart. How do we change hostility, what is uncomfortable and strange and uncomfortable, into hospitality? Now, I want to take you back as I get ready to take you to the text that we're going to look at, the Old Testament. I want to take you back to a ritual, a covenant that happened in the Far East. To be particular, what we would call today Palestine or Israel or Jordan or Syria, the Middle East. And it was a covenant that was called the blood covenant because it involved blood. And it was a way in which hostility and hospitality, that tension, could evaporate and be gone. And the way that it worked is two families would come together, and often it would be for marriage. And they would come together, and they would make an agreement, a contract, a covenant together. And in most cases, it happened between a strong party or family and a weaker one. It was unequal. And they would come together either for an alliance or maybe the marriage of a daughter and son, and they would begin to enter into one another's lives through exchanging things symbolically. The whole covenant usually had about 10 different steps to it. And I want to give you 7 of them today. And the first 3 involved exchanging something that meant something to your family. To tell the other family, we are giving this to you and we are taking from you so that we can remove any hostility and enter into a relationship of hospitality. And the first exchange that they would do would be a belt. And that belt would represent strengths, abilities, talents, skills, things that defined what the family could do. For someone like me today, it might be a tie. I think it's time to take this off. Something that identifies me maybe as a profession, maybe as the way I dress, maybe it describes where I work. We wear ties sometimes for different occasions. I have a Christmas tie. Something that shows who we are. That was the first exchange. The second exchange was an exchange of weapons. And the exchange of weapons told the other family or the other party, we will protect you. We have your back. If something comes up against you, you can count on us to help defend you. Now, we can't really relate to that today. Most of us probably aren't packing a handgun this morning. We don't carry a rifle in the back of our pickup. That's a little bit foreign to us as Canadians in Langley, but I think most of us can relate to other kinds of security. We love to lock things. Our cars, our houses, we have security alarms. We do all kinds of things to protect the people we love or the things that we own. And we understand that people get robbed. People take things that we want to keep, and we understand what it means to protect. That was the second exchange. The third exchange was an exchange of coats. And the Olympics are here, and there's going to be a lot of exchanging between athletes in the Olympics. Pins, hats. Athletes love to exchange with their competitors. One of my favorite sports to watch that isn't in the Olympics is soccer. And if you've ever seen an international soccer game, you know that after the game, all of a sudden, players start peeling off their jerseys. And you've got a bunch of topless men running around the field, and they run up to someone, and they exchange jerseys as a memory of that game. In this Eastern covenant, they would exchange an article of clothing, usually a coat, and that represented their identity, their family, where they came from, who they were. So you've got these three exchanges in this covenant. You've got an exchange of belts, you've got an exchange of weapons, and you've got an exchange of an article of clothing. And it was the beginning of two parties or two families opening up their lives to one another and being transparent and being authentic. And that leads us to our text today. And I want to read to you from Genesis 15. I don't have it on the screen for you, so if you don't have anything to look at, I'll give you a minute to look that up if you have a Bible. I'm just going to read it out loud to you. And you have heard about this story, but perhaps you have not read Genesis 15 looking through the eyes of a covenant between two parties, two groups. I want to read the whole chapter to you. It's not very long. So Genesis 15, verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram, for I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, O sovereign God, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit everything is my servant? Then the Lord came to him and said, this servant will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own blood and flesh will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Abram, look up at the heavens and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring and descendants be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur, and I'm going to give you a new land to take possession of. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can you know that I will get this land? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram scared them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years. But I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces of the animals. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. Abram has just been pulled into the Eastern blood covenant, and he would have known exactly what was going on. This was something that had been done for centuries before and would continue for centuries afterwards. And the key that would have triggered his understanding would be when God said, bring me some animals and cut them in half. I brought my favorite kitchen knife this morning. And I don't know if you can imagine or if you have butchered animals and the blood that flows from them. In this Eastern covenant, the reason you butchered an animal or animals was to create a flow of blood. And what you would do is you would find a small ditch or a ravine, didn't have to be very long, wide enough that two people could walk through it for a short distance. And you would cut the animals in half if they were large enough, and you would put one half on this side and one half on this side. And you would have a ravine or a ditch like this aisle that you could walk through, and on either side, at different intervals, there would be a piece of the animal that you had just slaughtered. And the blood would flow slowly down into the low point of the ditch or the ravine. And you would prepare that. You would allow the blood to flow until there was literally a small river of blood, or at the very least, the ground was saturated with blood, visibly. So when Abram hears this, he doesn't need any prompting. He doesn't need further instructions. He knows. We're doing the blood covenant. He may have seen it before. He definitely would have heard about it. He may have even been part of it with another group or family or clan in which he needed to make an alliance and enter into their life. So he goes and he cuts the animals. The next thing that they would do is each party would remove anything on their feet. This is the last article of clothing I am taking off, just so you know. If you want, take off your shoes, because I want to ask you something. You don't have to. But if you want, take off your shoes so that you feel the ground under your feet, because it's going to feel different. Depending whether you're on something smooth or I'm on this corrugated rubber mat. Feels a lot different, and it's okay for me to take my shoes off in here because I know that it's safe and there's not be any glass and the floor is fairly warm. But I wouldn't want to venture outside in my car on the asphalt where it's freezing. I want protection on my feet. I want them covered. And so the shoes would be taken off because you would walk through the blood with nothing on your feet. Just your skin on that dirt, the blood now coming up onto your feet. Depending on the quantity, it might be splashing onto your legs, onto your garment. And by the time you went through this, you would know, and other people would know, that you have just walked through blood. There would be no denying because it's all over you. And the way that you would walk through that little channel of blood is you would, with the other head of the other clan or family or house, the patriarch, the father figure, you would together clasp hands and you would walk through. And it was a sign as you walk through together that this is till death. If I break this covenant with your family in any way, if I don't protect you, if I don't watch over you, you can do to me what we did to these animals. You can take my life. That was the seriousness of it. And they would walk through together, and this would become the physical action of we have now entered one another's lives, one another's families. What I have, my skills, my talents, my protection, my identity, is now yours, and vice versa. And the idea of hospitality, engaging the stranger, allowing that door to open and someone to come into your life was now initiated. In order for this to be remembered, they would take a knife and they would make a small incision around the right thumb. And they would allow the blood to flow, and they would interlock hands, smear that blood on one another's hands. The idea of a blood brother originates from this idea, one way or another. And then, after they had done that, they would treat it with a herb that would cause that wound to become a thick scar. I used to teach woodworking and metalwork, and one day I had one of those Bruce moments that I like to call it, and I was building a headboard that involved metal slats with a wooden frame. And so I would cut the metal slats. The ends were sharp. I left them sharp because they were going to be covered with wood. And one particular one, I'd fit it and I couldn't get it out. And so I was wrestling with this piece of steel. It was stuck in the wooden groove that I had cut for it. And I was like, this is not coming out. It's too tight. I've made it fit too good. I want to take it out so I can sand the wood. And so I thought I need a little bit of leverage. So I lowered the whole frame and I got right over it. And I just, 1, 2, 3, and I drove it right into my neck. And I've got this big scar that every morning when I shave, I've got to make sure I don't cut myself open again because it's a big ridge on my throat. We all have stories of scars. Every single one of us. This is what I want you to do. I want you to turn to someone beside you, and you've got 45 seconds each. Tell them your best scar story. Go ahead, do it right now. Show them if you can. None? Okay. All right. Sounds like there's some good stories out there. I think we could spend a whole morning just talking about scars. I know I've got some more good stories. Now, the beauty of this particular covenant that Abram walks into with God is that it's completely unique. Because if we go down to, and I'll read it again, for verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot, smoke representing the presence of God, often the judgment of God, and a blazing torch, the purity, the holiness of God. And think about some places in the Bible where there's fire, pillar of fire for the people of Israel in the desert, or the cloud, or on Mount Sinai when Moses goes up and there's thunder and lightning and smoke. We see that imagery in other places. These two things appeared and passed between the pieces. Just before that, Abram had fallen into a sleep. So what we have here is not Abram walking through with God, not two people, as this Eastern covenant would normally expect to happen, but we had God walking through on behalf of both. Abram knew that he could never fulfill his side of this covenant. His exchange with God, he would make mistakes, he would fall short, and it would cost him his life. So God also knows this, and he walks through on behalf of both of them to seal this covenant and says, this covenant is permanent. I have promises for you, land, children. I will fulfill my side of the covenant. In fact, I will fulfill your side. And the expectations I have for you, I will look the other way when you fall short. And so this covenant becomes complete. And the rest of Scripture unfolds with this covenant. The coming of Jesus. The restoration of creation and revelation. I mean, we can follow in the pages of Scripture right through the books of history into the books of poetry and the prophets and into the New Testament and see connections over and over again to this incredible relationship where God says, I am watching out for humanity, and I am going to enter the lives of humanity with my Son. And we are making this covenant or this connection that will take us into eternity. I'm only giving you those 6 today, and our conversation isn't quite done because there's a whole lot more. It gets even better, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about this covenant. But I want to give you one glimpse into what this type of hospitality, what we see modeled in this Eastern covenant, what hospitality can begin to look like. Because all of us wrestle with the hostility and the hospitality. We're somewhere in between. That tension of how do we engage with, forget a neighbor or my enemy, how do I engage with my husband or wife or child or teacher or cousin or employer in a way that shows hospitality? I am both the guest and the host. I allow them to enter my life, and I look for ways to enter into their life, so that in everything we can do to others what we would have them do to us. Let me read you just a couple of pages from one of my favorite books. And for those of you who have read it, you'll know right away which book it is. Max stood in the bathroom looking into the mirror while wiping his face dry with a towel. He was searching for some sign of insanity in those eyes staring back at him. Was this for real? Of course not. It was impossible. But then he reached out his hand and slowly touched the mirror. Maybe this was a hallucination being brought on by all his grief and despair. Maybe it was a dream and he was asleep somewhere. Maybe he was still in the shack freezing to death. Suddenly a terrible crash broke in. It came from the direction of the kitchen and Mac froze. For a moment there was silence. And then unexpectedly he heard uproarious laughter. Curious, he exited the bathroom and poked his head through the doorway of the kitchen. Mac was shocked at the scene in front of him. It appeared that Jesus had dropped a large bowl of some sort of batter of sauce on the floor, and it was everywhere. It must have landed close to Papa because the lower portion of her skirt and bare feet were covered in the gooey mess. All three were laughing so hard that Mac didn't think they were breathing. Sarah, you said something about humans being clumsy, and all three started laughing again. Finally, Jesus brushed past Mac and returned a minute later with a large basin of water and towels. Sarah, you had already started wiping the goop from the floor and cupboards, but Jesus went straight to Papa and kneeling at her feet began to wipe off the front of her clothes. He worked down to her feet and gently lifted one foot at a time, which he directed into the basin where he cleaned and massaged her feet. Oh, that feels good. As he leaned against the door watching, Mac's mind was full of thoughts. So this was God in relationship. It was beautiful and so appealing. He knew that it didn't matter whose fault it was. The mess from some bowl had been broken, that a dish that had been planned would not be shared. Obviously, what was truly important here was the love they had for one another and the fullness it brought them. He shook his head. How different this was from the way he treated the people he loved. The tension between hospitality and hostility. Consider that challenge. Consider that tension as we take up this command. So in everything. It's not an option. As followers of Jesus, we are obligated to wrestle with this every single day in everything that we do. So in everything, love others. The seventh part of the covenant is a blessing, the pronouncement of a blessing on the other family or the other person or the other party. And I want to give you a blessing this morning from the book of Jude. So if you could just hold your hands out in some way to receive that, I want to give this to you as you leave this morning. Now to him who is able to keep us from falling, to present us before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy, to him be God of power, glory, majesty, and honor, through Jesus Christ our Lord, now and forevermore, throughout all generations. Amen.
Amen. Amen. So we're don't run away too quickly. We do have a family meeting for those of you who are able to